Hello, this is Sam from Sound on Sound magazine. I'm at the Ilio booth on the NAMM show in Anaheim, California, and I'm sitting with Andy Narell. Hey, Andy.
Good to meet you.
Now, Andy Narell, if you're not familiar with the name, is one of the world's leading experts on pan drums, or steel pans.
Steel pans, we call them. Yeah.
And which is quite a distinctive instrument, often associated with West Indian culture. How did you get involved with this?
I've been doing this since I was 7 years old. My dad started steel bands in New York as a community center program activity for kids in gangs. And he didn't really, at the time, it took off. You know, he had 20 bands going in a year and a half. And by 1962, we had the first steel band festival in America. And I started playing. My brother and I got some friends together. We had a band, and we just grew up playing steel band music. And it became my life's work. You know, I've been playing ever since. And you know, I compose, and I play at jazz festivals and concerts and clubs all over the world. And I work with steel bands and teach, and it's a life's work, you know.
Wow. So I guess the scope of the instrument has evolved quite a bit since those early days of calypso.
Oh yeah. In fact, I have in the library here, I have sampled the first one of my oldest pans. It's a pan that my dad brought back for me from Trinidad in 1963, and you can hear the evolution of the instrument from that to the modern day instruments. This is a completely different thing.
Well, we'll come to this sample library in a minute because it looks absolutely fascinating. But yeah, tell us a little bit about how the instrument has evolved over the years.
You know, this began in the 1940s with teenage kids from the poor neighborhoods in Trinidad who were mostly in gangs. And they were fighting with each other. And the early days of steel band music were like bands going out in the street and having fights. And they were basically beating rhythm on paint cans and biscuit tins and various kinds of metal. And the discovery was that you could tune more than one note on the top of one piece of steel. That was a revolutionary idea. All the other tuned percussion instruments, every note is a separate piece. But the pan, they figured out we can tune 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, or more on the top of one small drum. And then they expanded to the oil barrel, which was available because courtesy of the U.S. Navy and the oil industry and everything in the 1940s. And Elie was the first person Elie Manette was the first person to tune the notes of a scale on top of a 55-gallon drum and play tunes. And he and the other tuners, there was a tremendous amount of experimentation and energy in the first years. And within 15 years or so, they had created all the voices of an orchestra from soprano down to bass, and all the instruments were chromatic, where it started out with just a few notes. And so, you know, by the time I got into it in the early 60s as a little kid, all the pans it was a fully developed orchestra. But the techniques for tuning have changed and evolved over the years. Elie, for instance, in the early 60s, he hadn't discovered the use of harmonics yet on this. And it was the late 60s that all began, and everything changed because they could, instead of having random overtones, they could finely tune the note. They could tune the harmonics around the edges of notes, octaves and fifths, and the pan became a modern instrument that could, instead of just playing with each other, could play with everybody. You know, these instruments are perfectly tuned to equal temperament, and you know, you can play I can play with an orchestra, I can play with a jazz band, I can play on a pop record, and to play anywhere with these steel pans. And he, over a period of more than 70 years, maintained his status as the greatest tuner through all that development until he died a few years ago.
So this new product that we're talking about today, the sample library, this has both of your names on it.
Yeah, I've been playing Elie's instruments my whole life, or at least since 1967 or so, I started playing his instruments. And I had kind of had a negative view of sampling. I felt like, well, this is not mine to give away, you know, and let the keyboard players on the LA sessions I was playing on, just let them sample it. Back in the 80s, I was getting a lot of requests for that. And finally, it was like people were putting out pan sample libraries, and none of them sounded good to me, you know. And one of Ellie's students, who's a excellent pan tuner and player, Darren Dyke, he came to me and showed me an experiment that he did sampling a pan, and it was clean. You know, it wasn't there yet, but it was clean. And I went to Ellie and said, "Why don't we do this right?" You know, and I described what I thought we could do with this, and he signed on to it. You know, and the idea would be that I would play, I would sample everything, I would engineer it and put this whole thing together. It would be his instruments, and we would have his name on this virtual instrument. It would be part of his legacy to take 20 of his most beautiful instruments and make them available to all the musicians on the planet. Anybody that has a computer now can play Elie Manet's pans, and that's a breakthrough. And I feel like we got it right, you know.
So is this all single note samples that you play from a keyboard, or have you sampled phrases and licks as well?
Here, no, I didn't get into loops yet or anything. Basically, what I did was take each instrument. Now there are 5 different kinds of instruments and multiples of each. There are 4 different bass, 2 tenor bass, 4 guitars, 6 double seconds, and 5 tenors. Each instrument is a unique instrument, and I sampled every note in the orchestra at 35 to 40 different volumes, and then we cut them up into and sorted them by amplitude, load them into Contact Player, and then I balanced every instrument, each individual instrument, one sample at a time. I took every possible Midi velocity, said fixed velocity 1, 3, 5, 7, and went through it so that I would touch every sample in the library and balance the instrument so that you could, if you played a chromatic scale at that Midi velocity, it would sound beautiful and balanced. And once I got all the instruments balanced, then I started putting them together in combinations, because that's where things get really interesting. Instead of just playing one pan, now I can play the keyboard and play a whole section or a whole orchestra. And which was really essentially like mixing, the way I mix my albums. And I went from balancing one sample at a time to mixing instruments and combinations, and then putting those combinations together with each other to form an orchestra that's accessible by the keyboard. It was a lot of work.
It sounds like it.
And from there, we had to go to creating a graphic interface. And I worked with a programmer named Tracy Collins, who helped me create this graphic interface and write the script, and because I don't know how to write script. And and that took a couple of years of work to get it. It's finally out. This is a 5-year project.
Wow, so real kind of labor of love.
Yeah. I went into this figuring the person that I asked for advice on this going into it advised me not to do it. He said it'd be way too much work. You spend way too much money. It's not worth doing. Don't do it. And ultimately, I did it anyway. And he was the person that brought me to Mark Hiskey at Ilio, and the guy that told me not to do it. His name is Steve Miller. He's a great engineer, and we've done a lot of albums together.
Well, sounds like you've been proved right. Is this available now?
It's out. It's out since the end of March of 2022.
Wow. Well, I look forward to hearing it in action. How much is it going to cost?
It's for sale at Ilio for $199.
Well, that's sure going to be a better deal than buying your own steel pan orchestra.
Oh yeah, this is a lot of beautiful instruments, and then you'd have to learn how to play them. And for me, I was in order to do these albums where I was using a lot of pans, they were in different places, and I had to play the entire album on every instrument. So I had to play the whole album 25 times to create this orchestral sound. And now I have everything here, and I did my last album all with sampled pans at home on keyboards, and the only live players are drums, percussion, soloists, and so on. So and this is basically taking something that it's impossible for people to have these instruments and to be able to play them and overdub them in this way, and now it's all here.
Well, very impressive. Well, thanks, Andy. I'm looking forward to hearing it in action. And,
Great. Thanks
lovely
for,
to meet you.
Yeah, same here, and thanks for your interest in it. So, what you get when you open up the program is basically a full steel band right in front of you, and it sounds like this. And the thing to understand about this is what you're getting. This is the kind of like my go-to starting place, but it's just the beginning of what's possible with this, because all the instruments are inside. What you have here is a collection of instruments. You go to this is what a bass pan looks like. That's 6 barrels, and it's what these instruments look like. There are 3 notes on the top of each pan. And we have 4 distinct bass instruments, and then I made 3 different mix combinations. Each one has a different sound. So like that's one instrument, and it's a little hard to hear in here with all this noise going on, but these are all stereo images. That's 2 sets of bass, 3 sets of bass, 4 sets of bass, and to meet the instruments, there's the tenor bass, the triple guitars. I have 4 of them in the library. There are 6 different double seconds. That's the instrument I play when I go out on tour and as a soloing instrument. And the tenor pan, which is the classic single soprano range instrument. And there are 5 distinct instruments. So what the presets are, for instance, this first preset has 4 sets of bass, 2 sets of tenor bass, 4 triple guitars, 4 sets of double seconds, and 5 tenors are all contained in that patch. And if you want to, let's see, where am I? If you want to get an idea of where you start, let's just say you want to hear I just want to play a pan, you know? Okay, so here's a pan, a double second, and this is one. That's the range of that instrument. And there are 6 different ones. They all sound different. Then you have stereo combinations. That's 2 of them. And you spread it out to say 4. Even from sitting here, you could hear the change in the stereo image. So that's how I mix on albums. And you can take this, for instance, this patch, and you say, well, I want to do something a little different. I just want a solo, but so let me mute those, and then you can, let's say I want a little brighter sound. I bring the guitars down, because the guitars are doubling all the way up here to C sharp. And so you can play with mixing levels of each type of instrument. You can also play with the ranges. Let me just hit this so I get my level back. You can also adjust the ranges right here, so that, for instance, there's a lot of overlap in this octave here between the guitars and the double seconds and the tenor. And what I found is a way to just brighten that is just get the guitars out of that octave. You hear the difference? And you still have this whole patch. But the range, the sound in that range is completely different. So it's like EQ-less EQ. you know. And I have a bunch of presets for that. I have various combinations of instruments also. So, you know, this is like a smaller band, yet a smaller one. You can see by the number of instruments that you have there, how many are in the patch. So that's the first area, is just choosing instruments, and you can start with my preset and then go in and change anything you want. Different combination of instruments, different levels. But the real, you know, Pans have an incredibly large dynamic range, and when I'm playing a keyboard, I'm not playing from 1 to 127. I'm playing in a given MIDI velocity range, and so we put this touch control, which is really MIDI velocity, and so with the same touch, you have from there and you can hear it's not just volume. I'm actually hitting the pans harder, which gets a completely different sound. Steel pans played softly have far few higher harmonics than when they're played loud, and people are kind of used to hearing that sound loud. So, you know, if you want that sound, it's there. But my default, for instance, is to lower the MIDI velocity by a factor of 20, and you preserve the dynamics of what you're playing, but you can just kind of it even actually goes higher. So, and you can see what's going on here if you actually go back to the mapping editors. You see everything's kind of up high here. Whereas if I put this down, you can see that the MIDI is way down there. And so you're actually playing the pan softer. There are about 35 to 40 samples of every single note in the orchestra, and you're playing, you know, you can keep playing the way you play your keyboard and the dynamics that you want to play, but choose the kind of tone you want right here in the touch section with MIDI velocity, and then adjust volume later. You know, obviously louder is louder, but I encourage people to think of this as a tone control, not a volume control, because you're completely changing the sound of the pans when you do it. We put in a harmonizer, which is not an audio harmonizer. It's an actual, you're actually playing the pans at an octave, in 2 octaves, with a choice of intervals, you know. So this is my go-to. I do a lot of solo. So that's a whole section of pans doubled by the whole section of pans, as if I could play that whole phrase in octaves, which kind of starts to bring me into the range of being able to play things that are impossible on the pan, to be able to improvise and play a whole section of pans in octaves. That's just like it's incomprehensible from a physical point of view, you know.
Wow, so not only a really authentic recreation of that steel pan sound, but also sort of going beyond it.
Yeah, for me, that was the most exciting thing about creating this program, was to realize I was getting into things that I couldn't do anymore. There's a whole new world of possibilities with the pans because of what you can do by having them all loaded into this computer that way and being able to access it with MIDI. You know.
Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing what people do with this.
I'll show you a few more things about it real quick. You have an effects panel right there where you have like chorus, delay, reverb sends, high pass filter, and a band of parametric EQ for each channel. Each instrument is grouped to a channel, basically, each type of instrument. And we have, you know, if I want to get the sound of sustain and rolling on pans, you do it with single stroke rolls. But it's very hard to roll one note on a keyboard, so we put that in here. And you can control the speed. So it's really useful for going back in, especially I like to go back in after I've played stuff and look at the places where I really want to hear the rolls and just add them in as a separate track behind. But you could play it live and trigger it. We have a key switch and it can trigger with the sustain pedal. Here's the effects return section where you have reverb on and off and reverb adjustment. This is the stereo spread if you want to change that. Delays, return, chorus. This is all the contact stuff if you want to use it. You can access it right here. And this button is really handy, the solo select group, because for instance, if I go in here and I want to audition these pans, I still hear the whole band. But if I hit this, it'll solo out. I'm hearing only the double seconds now, and I can experiment with different sounds and different pans, different combinations. What was I going to say about that? I'm sorry. Yeah. So it's really useful.
Yeah, I mean,
and
obviously you really thought about this.
And we've got these presets. I'll show you. Here's the old pan we were talking about. Oh, I know what I wanted to mention was that you can see that all the mute and solo buttons are hooked up to the visuals. So, for instance, if I hit solo or mute, so you get some visual feedback about what you're doing. And here's the old pan. This is what pan sounded like when I started out.
You can really hear those overtones, the enharmonic.
Yeah, when I play that pan, I go right back to the music I was playing when I was 8 years old. It just takes me right back into the old calypso sound, the old steel band sound of the 50s. And so you have, I decided to add one beautiful old pan to the library. And that my dad brought that particular instrument back in 1963 from Trinidad. And then you can all these changes you do, you can save them to your own presets, and you can change the outputs and so on. Awesome. That's pretty much how it works.
Wow, Andy, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Really great to meet you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Great show.
Thank you.